the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. Sheldon Fulton has been a consultant in the Canadian energy sector, specializing in the design and implementation of markets for the past 25 years. Mr. Fulton's ability to draw on 50 years of experience in commodity market analysis, automation of commodity exchanges for a diverse range of commodities in various international markets, provides a unique perspective for the Canadian energy markets. Mr. Fulton is president of Forte Business Solutions. Forte provides consulting services to the energy and agricultural markets on economic and market issues. Now let's get into the episode with Sheldon. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Good to be back.
Yeah, thanks, Lysandra. I'm looking forward to another exciting podcast with our guest today.
As am I. On today's episode, we are joined by Sheldon Fulton, president of Forte Business Solutions. Welcome, Sheldon.
Hello.
And today we have Dave kicking us off on our episode about energy market design. On to you, Dave.
Well, thank you, Sheldon. I have been looking forward to this podcast for a long time. Sheldon is, I would say, an expert in involvement in designing electrical markets, and certainly he'll be talking about that a lot. For our listeners, I love markets. I think it's the best way of actually moving things along the most effective way, and Sheldon can even discuss that. So Sheldon, here's my question, and for our listeners, I think a lot of people are kind of interested in this. What are the merits of a regulated industry in the electrical market versus a deregulated industry in the electrical markets? Can you share what your thoughts are on that?
Yeah, and maybe just I'll take a quick step back and try to explain the difference between what is almost a misnomer, a regulated market and a deregulated market. You're either a market or you're not. And that's part of the problem, because we perceive that we can have a regulated market, which really means I'm orchestrating outcomes. I want to regulate it so I get the outcomes that I'm looking for. Whereas in a deregulated environment, a true market, we let something called price make those decisions that otherwise we think some smart guys in a room can try and figure out. And the price is what's ultimately important. You got to preserve the integrity of that price. So the difference between a regulated industry or sector, and I'll take my home province, Manitoba, and Manitoba Hydro, as a regulated electrical utility. It sets prices based on costs. It makes investment decisions. It hires people. It fires people. It gets into all kinds of things that electrical utilities should, and then calculates all of that cost and then divides it by how many people there are and what they're doing and what the government wants to promote in terms of make interest, and sets that as a rate. And that rate is charged for the next year, whatever length of time it is. In a deregulated environment, which we sort of have in Ontario, but relatively poor, and sort of have in Alberta, which is out of control, and we'll talk about the other side of a market, because that's the downside, Dave, is a market structure where we allow the participants to interact, establish price. That price flows through to the consumer, and that's what he's charged. And then when the government doesn't like it, they put a cap on it, or they try to do a bunch of things to, quote, stop the market forces from doing what it is that they're trying to do. So the fundamental difference is in how that system works on a day-to-day or even minute-by-minute basis, and what the outcomes are as a result of those two different environments.
So just a little follow-up, and just for, again, our listeners, I personally like markets, as you said, is I have the perception or belief that in deregulated markets, and as you said, it has to be designed properly, per se, but it gives customers more options for them to choose that's best for them versus a regulated, and you really don't have many choices at all. It's just the way it is. And why I like that in the energy markets is it actually drives customers' participation versus thinking, I can't do anything, so I just won't try to even control energy. That's the
Yeah,
difference.
I mean, it's the way that you get to respond in a regulated environment. You can go in front of the regulator. You can hire, accountants or lawyers or environmentalists to put your position in, and then hope that you can persuade the regulator. And if that doesn't work, you can use, elections and political elements. We're about to do that here in Alberta. We're going to have an election in a couple of months, and it's going to have electricity on the agenda. In a deregulated or in your market environment, it's independent investment decisions that are being made by people investing in that sector to produce electricity. And the flip side is the buyer has alternatives, presumably in what he can pay. We have a or deregulated retail market here. When I say semi, because there's still 40% that are on regulated or what are called regulated rates. Those options are important, but they can still be befuddled by a poorly designed market. And you touched on the important elements, Dave, that when politicians get or governments get to make a decision, they've kind of got three buckets they can draw from. They can look at a market, they can look at regulation, or they can look at what's called command and control. They basically say, here's what we're going to do. And out on that extreme, command and control is like a carbon levy that's imposed. You don't have a choice. You got to pay it whenever you're consuming whatever it is. And in Canada, we give most of it back. Regulations say we're going to create a regulatory environment, and then you, the utility or whatever it is, has to live within that environment. A market environment says we're going to let people take risk, which is the magic four-letter word in this case, in terms of what they do, except to a large extent, the failure of electricity markets is they don't allow that risk to flow through. We don't have failures. We don't have an FTX like the crypto market or an SVB like the banks. We just don't allow anybody to fail. And by doing that, we transfer all that risk to the buyer because he has to pay for the failure of people to do things that they would otherwise have failed and gone bankrupt and whatever.
I want to be looking forward a little bit. The background to my question is we know most jurisdictions are committing to net zero at some point. We also know that most people working to this believe that electricity is the solution, that we get nice clean electricity, we use that, we drive ourselves towards net zero, the push for electric vehicles, etc., etc. So the question is, and this gets interesting, isn't it, when given some of the things you've already said, but if you were designing a market that was going to support net zero, what are the top three things that you would include in the design of that market?
Yeah, and John, I'm going to cheat a little bit because I've got two top threes.
Okay.
So, so the first is that we need to look at the basic building blocks for a market. And there's three of them. There's the commodity that you're trying to transact and the description of that commodity, which includes things like its attributes and includes things like where is it being produced and what's it take to be able to transport it. All of those. That's the commodity that's being transacted. And then in the middle of that is something called the pricing mechanism. So the pricing mechanism is how do you discover that price and how does that price get communicated between buyer and seller? And there's a number of mechanisms. You can use auctions, you can use bid offer systems that stock exchanges work, or you can use single price mechanisms the way Ontario and Alberta try to set prices for electricity. And then the third component of that is equally important. It's called the rules and procedures for participation. So the rules and procedures govern what happens with that contract after it's traded, and it also deals with the participants in terms of what they're doing. So when we go back and say we want to get to net zero, we need to think about all three of those. And then let me boil that down into the three that I'm trying to answer your question with, and they're the price. So what price message do I want to send? What signal am I sending to the market? There's performance. So what constitutes the performance between the buyer and seller? Let me come back to that one for just a second. And then there's something called risk transference. And if you don't allow risk to transfer between the buyer and the seller after the transaction occurs, it isn't going to work. So to get to net zero, what we need to do is we need to start with, well, what is it that we're trying to do? We're trying to generate more electricity with a lower carbon footprint. So we want to incent things like solar and renewables like wind and hydro. And we want to use natural gas as efficiently as we can. And we want to phase out coal or high carbon intensity electrical generation. We can look at some other elements of that in addition to where we generate that electricity. We design most of our systems to big generation projects, either hydro or coal, and then we transmit it and then we distribute it. We could easily look at the flip side of that, and we've got another question coming up, but we could look at distributed generation now that the world can do it. If we then look at the next part, which is what is it that we're going to transact, and then how are we going to transact it, we need to create a pricing model that's going to send the right price signal to the market. And our current price signals in Ontario and Alberta are to not consume electricity when it gets to be really expensive. And then we make it really expensive by letting 3 or 4 guys control the market. And most of those guys used to have coal facilities, strangely enough. What we need to do is change that dynamic totally if we're going to get to a net zero situation where the premium product, the best product on the market is that one that has the least emissions and is the most reliable and occurring during periods of high consumption, aka solar, except in the wintertime. And then the second aspect of that is, well, how do we modify or mitigate that price risk that occurs when I'm producing it when it's dark. So the last element of that is risk transference. We need to make sure that those that make the investments are in fact taking certain risks. And again, let me give you bad market design, then we can figure out how we can fix it. In Alberta, we have huge amounts of investments occurring in renewables, in solar and wind. Most of it is being driven by large corporations like Amazon, the Royal Bank, anybody that wants to come along and buy some carbon offset credits, or the oil and gas sector, which is looking for as many credits as they can get. But the costs that are being borne are all being borne by the buyer, by the consumer, by myself. In the sense that those projects don't pay for any transmission, they don't pay for any distribution. Most of the companies that are engaged aren't consuming the product in any case, so they're not taking any risk. They're not being exposed to it because the risk is all being transferred over to the buyer, and it's being transferred in the name of what you were saying, net zero. So buyer, you got to stop complaining because we're moving towards a disaster in 2050 if we don't do something. So we can placate the masses when they get the risks transferred to them by virtue of saying, well, it's all for the good of where we're headed in this particular direction. So proper market design is going to flip that on its head. It's going to put the risk where it belongs. It's going to make sure that the price signal we're sending is incenting the best product that we want and de-incenting those that we don't want. And then it's going to monitor performance in such a way that the bad actors get moved out.
Yeah, it's an interesting response. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, there's two potential scenarios. One which doesn't exist, which is we didn't have an electricity market and we had a clean sheet of paper and we could design a system, a market. But we've got this thing, and it's this whole business of the transition from high carbon to low carbon. We've got the same with the markets, haven't we? We've got markets that are built on centralized generation, and it didn't really matter what carbon content you've got, and you're trying to move from that to the next market.
Yeah, I mean, and we're trying to use the same structure that we
Yes.
built 25 years ago. So everything else in the world has changed except the way that we are looking at, as you put it, one of the fundamental building blocks of how we're going to get to net zero. But we don't bother having that discussion. They're going to have a session in Banff here in a week or so, talking about how wonderful the electricity market in Alberta is. and they're going to be totally not examining what it is they need to, which is what role does electricity play in getting to a net zero environment? Not just
Yeah.
net zero for electricity, that's on the agenda, but it's net zero for everybody else. And have
Yeah.
we got the right incentives with respect to it?
Yeah, and you're right there, because we in these podcasts we've touched on this before, that net zero electricity is so important because there are going to be fossil fuel activities that are going to transfer over to electrically driven activities as part of the transition. Yeah, it's a biggie, isn't it?
Well, it
I
is, and again, this is where the price signal aspect of it is so important. So we need to
Yeah,
make sure that industry that wants to consume carbon offsets is the industry that needs it most. And if it's transition industry, we need to facilitate, quote, that transition industry. The transition industry right now in electricity is essentially natural gas, and yet we keep trying to put up barriers to that rather than trying to manage that process and let the risk transfer into the natural gas as we can displace it with higher premium value electricity, aka lower carbon footprint. And so we need to price the carbon into the electricity price that
yes,
everybody is paying, not collectively, because if I do something to avoid it, I want to have the benefit of that.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's part of the failure when you have a single pricing mechanism that we got in electricity. One price gets generated every 5 minutes, and it's supposed to do all these wonderful things. Well, it's impossible, and it doesn't do any of them well.
Yeah, thank you.
You mentioned the word about DER. So my question is, what's the impact of moving from a centralized generation, which historically has been the case, to distributed energy resources, and how would a market incent or accelerate the distributed energy resources model?
I mean, it comes back to those building blocks again. In the sense that we need the price incentive to make the investment, and that's the key one in this particular case. Because if I'm going to move to distributed generation, I need a price signal that says I'm going to get a return on that investment. So now we've got to say, well, what are the components of that investment return? And there's four of them. Three of them are monetary, and one of them is, you feel good about it. So the first one is what do I save in terms of my alternative price for that electricity? So what am I displacing from a price perspective, and when am I generating with my distributed project? The second one is the fact that I'm generating the electricity right beside where I'm consuming it. So I don't have to have transmission costs. I don't have to have distribution costs. I may have to buffer that with some storage facilities. So I might have to have some battery to buffer, but I can build those on site now. And so I can make myself self-contained from that aspect of it. So if I do that, do I make any savings in my costs with respect to transmission and distribution? Unfortunately, no. In most cases, there's some quote credits, but I don't get the direct benefit of what I just did. The third one is my lower carbon footprint. So it's like I was mentioning to John that we have, if we're pricing carbon into it and we're incenting the higher value electricity generation because it's lower carbon. So I measure the intensity and it's worth more. I need to be able to capture that benefit. So either I get an offset that I can sell back into the market, or I can use it for my own purposes if I'm a business or whatever else it is. The fourth one is I'm contributing to the solution rather than being part of the problem. And so I need to have that recognized. And the way you do that is that you create a program that makes it easier to do it rather than more difficult. And I know in both Ontario and Alberta and almost every jurisdiction in Canada, it's almost impossible to put solar up on your roof easily. We're making it easier. We're getting rid of some of the red tape and all the nonsense about you're going to black out the system if you put too many solar panels up. We're having some creative stuff like Jamin here in Calgary that are putting solar on every single roof of every new house that they build. That's the kind of incentive that they see, except they're capturing the benefit out of selling houses and probably selling them to people that are more carbon conscious. But it's the same factors. Whenever you're designing a market, you always got to start and say, well, what do I want the price signal to do? What's it supposed to be signaling? And then how do I do that? So what's the pricing mechanism? And then what are the rules and procedures with respect to it? And I want to make DERS the highest value element of it because in the long term, it's the best way to go.
So just to follow up, I understand exactly what you said. Unfortunately, I think a lot of customers don't even know, many don't realize the breakdown of their electrical costs. They don't know there's commodity. They don't realize there's a transmission and distribution. So they don't know what they should be asking for in that situation. And I'm thinking the current establishment, meaning the utilities, and they're not going to open up that Pandora's box because that doesn't serve them well. So I'm kind of curious how this is going to get manifested going forward.
Yeah, it's going to take some courage to get it to happen. And you're right on that, Dave, that the existing utilities create the barrier. And then eventually they get to the point of saying, well, we need to control this rather than fight against it. So what you have in a lot of jurisdictions is the primary supplier of rooftop solar is, NMAX here in Calgary, or it's EPCOR up in Edmonton. It's the local utility, and the local utility does not want to give up its revenue base in terms of distribution, and if they're beyond that in terms of transmission. So their structuring of what they do is to continue to control that part of it. In Alberta, most of the in Calgary rather, and most of the rooftop solar is being driven by programs from the utilities because they get to make it easy, because they're the utility. They can say, yeah, then we can easily put up your solar. We'll hire, we'll farm it out to this outfit and they'll put it up, and then we'll put your meters in and everything's going to be fine. So it's an easy sale for them. And it's really, really difficult if you're trying to move into that market and you're trying to compete against them because they're the barrier. They singularly control the distribution system. And so they're going to say, well, you, Mr. Homeowner, you can't really do that. You can't hire those guys to put the solar panels up because if they do, it's going to create a problem on the distribution system and will make you financially responsible. And the government believes them every single time. They go to the regulator says, yeah, you're right. We can't jeopardize the system. And so system security becomes what it should be, a natural competitive situation in terms of where do I get my electricity? Do I get it from my roof? Or do I have to get it from some coal facility or some natural gas facility jurisdiction outside of Calgary? It's just, let me give you an interesting one just to ponder for a moment. I checked this morning to see what was happening. We have a price in Alberta this morning at $141 a megawatt hour. For what particular reason? It's a really nice semi-spring day. It's going to be 2 degrees. The load is at around 10,000 megawatts. We're importing 600 megawatts from BC and from Montana and from Saskatchewan. And the reason we're importing electricity, even though we're idling a whole bunch of capacity, is because those provinces or those jurisdictions can make $140 a megawatt hour, and their home jurisdiction is only like $50 or $60 a megawatt hour. We've created a price differential where we're incenting renewable electricity generation outside of the province. It just tells you how wrong the signal is from that perspective. And so we've got to focus on that price signal and how it gets generated and what are the consequences of what it's doing.
Thanks for that, Sheldon. You touched on net zero markets and DER generation's impact on markets. Is there a difference between a market for net zero and a market for energy security?
Yeah. So I'm going to get a little more complicated on that one, Sandra. When I'm defining my commodity, so that's the first of those 3 building blocks. So I'm doing my commodity definition. It will have things which in the world of commodities are called attributes. So let me go back to my farming roots. If I produce wheat, one of the attributes of wheat is its protein content. And the higher the protein content, the more it's worth, the more I can sell it for to the millers and all the rest of it. In electricity, we don't attach attributes to it. We don't say that was generated from a coal facility or generated from a renewable electricity facility or whatever. So there's no carbon intensity. We can measure it, but we don't actually put it into the commodity in terms of its pricing. And then let's go to your security piece of it. So the complaint is, well, the wind doesn't blow all the time, or it's only getting 30% utilization. We can get 90% utilization out of a coal plant. So, and it's more reliable. We can dispatch it, except in electricity in both of the jurisdictions in Canada that are deregulated. We take all of that security, we call them ancillary services, and we charge them to the consumer. We don't even add them onto the price. We don't say, well, I want to give a premium to a more highly reliable delivery of a product. So a natural gas facility with fast ramping should be worth more from a security attribute perspective than a solar facility or a wind facility that's less reliable. So now I've got two things going on. I'm adding a premium for that natural gas fast ramp, but I'm discounting it because it's got a carbon footprint. And I'm adding value to the solar and the renewable because they have no carbon aspect to them, but I'm discounting them because they're less reliable. I make them pay for the reliability. So those guys need to make a contract with the fast ramp generator fellow that's over here and say, I can deliver you a reliable, low emissions product. I can combine those two things and I can deliver that to you. And I should now be able to get a double premium out of the market. Well, what do? We take all of those security requirements and we add them on to something called ancillary services. And believe it or not, in Alberta, we charge that on our transmission. So it's added to the transmission. So again, if I got those rooftop solar, I still pay it, even though I'm not using it. And so we've disconnected all of those pieces. But if we were taking just those two attributes and putting it onto the electricity guy and saying, you got a discount because you're not reliable, but you got a premium because you're low emissions, let the market sort it out. If you want to value add your product, then you go make a deal with the guy that's got the reliability. You make the deal, not me. You make that deal, and then you sell me that product because I'll pay you more for it if the economics or the equilibrium point gets reached. It's not a hard thing to solve, but I can tell you that in 25 years, I've never seen an ISO either in Alberta or Ontario that will actually contemplate that as a solution. They throw it out right away. Oh, no, we can't do that. We can't have reliability as a separate pricing element. What happens? We'll have rolling blackouts all over the place. I mean, they can fear monger it so fast that you simply can't get to stage one with respect to it.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. It goes to show the complexity of the markets. Now, my question, I think I ought to give a bit of background to why I'm asking my question, because it's from the UK experience. Now, in the UK, our gas and electricity utilities were state monopolies. We then privatised them, was the language used. We then introduced what we called a regulator, the Office of Gas and Electricity Markets. And they have a role which is not fully understood by many people. They're supposed to be the leader of the consumer. It's been suggested that they're the ally of the producer. But what's happened here recently is that the regulator has set a maximum kilowatt hour, a cap. What we've had, because of the energy problems we've had, the government has then made payments to residential and commercial users to compensate them because the rate cap has gone up. And we've just had our budget today, and they're extending that assistance for a further 3 months. So that's the background I'm talking from. And my question is, who regulates an unregulated energy market?
Well, it's a good question, but I chuckle because it's interesting where the solution that you just talked about, the one we have that our new premier just implemented here in Alberta, is I'm going to put a cap on it. So just think about that in terms of what I was talking about in terms of the three fundamentals of a deregulated market, an unregulated market. The first one is price. So if I cap that price, I'm losing the signal. And the problem with that is Well, where does the money come from to compensate for that? So, I, and I don't know the UK one that well, John, but let me give you the most recent example
Yeah.
we've got here. In December, we capped the electricity at 13.5 cents, $135, which is an enormous price. We've never seen prices like that in 20 years.
Yeah.
That's what we capped it at. The actual prices that were filed at that time were double that. Okay, they were close to
Yeah.
30 cents a kilowatt hour. So we've in 3 months, Jan, Feb, March, deferred $200 million worth of electricity payments. But guess who pays the $200 million? The same consumers that are now getting 13.5 cents. They're going to surcharge it onto their bill starting in
Right.
April. And so what have you done? You've lost a really good price signal and you blunted it, but you make the same people pay for it in down the road. And no investment decisions, nothing have been made to try to mitigate the problem. And that's the risk when you interfere with respect to it. So when you say who regulates it, are they in fact regulating those three buckets that we talked about? Or is really what they're doing orchestrating outcomes that are different than what the market design is doing? And to a large extent, and then they're saying, well, we've got to regulate the market. We can't afford to have those things occur. Mostly retired now. I get to listen to all of the news, and I keep listening to the SVB, the Silicon Valley Bank, and should we bail it out? Should we not bail it out? And I keep coming back to the same thing, that if you'd done a proper job of designing the market in the first place, the risk transfer would have properly occurred, and there would be nobody hurt by it. That's the benefit of a well-designed market. But what we do is we get one side or the other complaining, and then we relax those regulations or those rules and procedures, which was that third bucket. We relax those, we get negative outcomes, and then we want the government to step in and do it. We've got, in terms of the difficulty with regulating utilities, is we have that real conflict between, am I regulating a utility or am I regulating a market? And the people that we have that form the boards for doing that regulation presumably mostly come from that utility background. I mean, that's where they come from. And because they're out of that utility background, they have that mentality that says, well, we can fix this by having this new quote regulation. They don't come from a market background. In fact, anytime you put a market guy on one of those ones, he eventually gets forced off the board because he's not doing what everybody else wants him to do. And so the problem is, who regulates it? It's like that proverbial question we get here. Should it be the Alberta Securities Commission that regulates the electricity market here? Or should it be the Alberta Utility Commission that regulates it? Do we want a utility commission regulating a market? And that's what we got. The Securities Commission doesn't regulate the market. They should be, but they don't.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, here there is the political dimension. We have seen domestic utility costs double or treble. So immediately there's a political imperative as a government to say that you're doing something about it.
And John, and who are always the convenient that get the blame with respect to it? I mean, who do we blame? And because that's the world in 2023, or ever since
Yeah.
2020, is we got to find somebody to blame. We
Yes,
don't
we
go
have.
back and try to fix it. What we do is say, well, somebody's fault. So let's go find
Yes.
out whose fault it is. And let's debate that, as opposed to doing what you really need to do, is roll up your sleeves and fix it.
Well, the apparent thing here, with those of us who look at it and think about it, is our energy markets, certainly our electricity and gas markets, aren't really fit for purpose. But as you say, people who are involved in it don't want to be part of the change. So I'm not quite sure how it does get changed.
Well, Sheldon, this has been an excellent episode. To end this off for our listeners, what is the biggest takeaway?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that we need to redesign these markets. We need to step back and say, just the fundamental building blocks all over again. When we deregulated 25 years ago, everybody was doing it. Europe was doing it. US was doing it. 2 or 3 jurisdictions in Canada were doing it. All of it was because we thought markets were going to help us get new capacity and rebuild the system and all those other kinds of wonderful things. Some folks thought we were going to get cheaper electricity as a result of it. Let's look back and say, well, 25 years ago, what were all the factors driving that? And then let's look at 2023, 2024 and say, what are the new factors? And certainly net zero is much more important than what it was back then. But there's also a whole lot of new technology that's out there. And are we properly deploying that technology? Remember, a market can deploy new technology much more efficiently than a regulator. Regulators take forever to do stuff in terms of, quote, new technology. But guys that can invest and make $1 by investing and making $1, they'll do it. And they'll do it much quicker. And so the benefit of a deregulated structure versus regulated, I'm going to finally answer the question, is that it's much more efficient. It drives outcomes faster than any of the other alternatives that are available, much faster than regulation, and certainly much faster than command and control, particularly when you have a lot of new technology that needs to be deployed and you've got new objectives in mind, which is, I got to produce this stuff without a lot of carbon.
Thanks for that, Sheldon. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
I think my biggest takeaway, I've thoroughly enjoyed this. I think it's been really interesting. But my biggest takeaway goes back to something we've talked about in these podcasts before. And it's, for want of a better word, we've talked about energy literacy and education. Part of the problem we've got is most of the people who are paying for the utilities don't understand how they're generated, how they're priced, where it goes. And I think there's a big piece that has to be done there.
Thanks, John. Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I loved what Sheldon was saying, it has to change based on how we have to move. And that is, effectively, if you have renewables and there's less carbon, then there should be a premium. And then if the security and reliability, if you can move that, there should be a premium. Like, that thought process seems to be pretty common sense, which we, as he suggested, wasn't set up 25 years ago. And I think, based on my experience, the people, as Sheldon suggested, who actually design markets or involve markets, I don't know if they'll come to grips with that. I think that's a huge hurdle for them to appreciate, because I want to reinforce is what Sheldon said. I'm convinced a lot of people who are in the electrical industry are not market force people. They're more regulated or like regulations. But I think it's going to have to change. And so we've got a big bump or hurdle to overcome for us to do this transition, in summary.
Thanks, Dave. All right, great episode. Thanks so much for your time today, Sheldon.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Sheldon.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn post. See you next week.